Welcome to Next Round by the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Itchon. In this podcast, our guest is Jarrett Dieterle, Senior Fellow with the R Street Institute. Jarrett just authored a brief on one of the most controversial bills in this legislative session, AB 5. AB 5 may force many independent contractors, that is, freelance journalists, Uber drivers, and people who essentially work for themselves, to change their status and become employees. Independent contractors who enjoy their freedom to work on projects for different companies, set their own hours, even work part-time, and so on may be forced to become employees or exit the workforce altogether. Tim Minaya, PRI's Director of Communications, and Wayne Weingarten, PRI Senior Fellow in Business and Economics, discuss with Jarrett the problems of AB 5 and the need to offer more flexibility for California workers. Thanks for joining us.
Jarrett, welcome to PRI's Next Round podcast. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Well, we're so happy that you could come on now in the final last weeks of the legislative session when the crunch is on for all of the hot bills before the legislature adjourns in September. Perhaps the hottest issue is one that you've done some work on, which is AB 5, and our listeners may know it also as the Dynomax issue, which relates to a state Supreme Court ruling on the issue. Since the legislature came back into session on the 12th, we've had a lot of hot news. Elizabeth Warren came in and endorsed the bill and said that everyone has to pass it. And we've also heard from the President of the Senate, Toni Atkins, that in her view, she thinks it's not going to be resolved before the end of the session. We know, however it shakes out, will have a huge implication for anyone who really works as an independent contractor in California. So it occurs to me that not everyone may know what we're talking about. So maybe you could start with a little bit of a step back. What is the Dynomax ruling, and how did it set up the huge fight that lawmakers and advocates are engaged in today?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the Dynomax ruling was a California Supreme Court decision that came out last year in 2018. And it originally started, it was a courier service that was named Dynomax. And the fight started over a decade ago, actually. They had traditionally classified their workers and drivers as employees for wage and hour purposes. And then they actually ended up reclassifying them as independent contractors. The drivers banded together and sued a class action complaint against Dynomax, arguing that they still were employees under the state's labor and unfair competition laws. And years of legal wrangling kind of went on. Eventually, it made its way to the California Supreme Court, and they ruled unanimously against Dynomax, holding that the drivers were in fact employees. So that's the factual background of it. What the court did that kind of was a big deal legally and upended decades of California labor law was it decided that there should be a new test for determining whether workers were employees or whether they were contractors. Previously, there had been what was known as the Borello standard, which again was named after another court case. There was used many different factors, looked at things like the employer's control level or how much a worker or independent contractor could direct their own behavior, things like that. It was a multi-factored, a long list of different factors. The Dynomax ruling instituted what was known as the ABC test, and it basically switched the presumption. So the presumption would be that a worker was an employee unless they could show the three parts of this test. And so the A part was that they had to show they weren't being directed by the firm in question. And then the second part, B, was that they were doing work outside the scope of what the company typically did, their typical business. And then C, they had to show they had made an affirmative decision. They said, they called it, to go into business for themselves. So if that was not demonstrated by the firm that their workers met all that criteria, then they would be considered employees. So it was a very big deal case under labor law, particularly because of the way that test was construed. Factor B in particular of it, the idea that the work needed to be outside the scope of the company's typical business, that almost is an outcome determinative test. And so what that means is that a lot of industries, things like real estate agents, insurance agents, even freelance journalists, suddenly could be considered employees under the logic of the test, full-time or full status employees rather than independent contractors, which has huge implications for how those employees are compensated and managed by the firms in question.
You just talked about some of the employees that could be impacted, but a lot of the debate also centers on innovative startups, or if you're working for online firms like Upwork or FlexJobs, and the opponents of AB5 are saying that this bill is going to have a negative impact on those types of workers. Based on your research, do they have reason to fear?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and the short answer is yes. And so just to kind of complete the loop, I guess I should take a step back, and I think we already maybe have noted this, but AB5 is basically the California legislators' attempt to codify the Dynomax decision into state law. And so, yes, if AB5 were to pass and all these employees all these workers that have traditionally been considered independent contractors were suddenly reclassified to be employees, that would have a lot of impact on the flexibility that they have. A lot of the people that work independent contractor jobs, whether it's ones in the gig economy or whether it's more traditional ones, they have total control over their hours and flexibility, and they tend to really like that. A lot of times that's why they want to be independent contractors. There's been a lot of surveys of people that operate as freelancers and independent contractors, and like 9 out of 10 of them prefer being so to being a traditional employee. And so when you are a traditional employee, then all of a sudden the overtime rules, wage and hour rules apply to you. Suddenly your employer has to do things like scheduling shifts of employees to make sure one of them isn't working too much, or making sure that they have a certain amount when they need them. One of the great benefits of for example, the on-demand economy is if there's a sudden surge of demand in drivers, maybe after the Super Bowl, say, there's a bunch of people that want it, then that encourages more drivers to come onto the road kind of spontaneously. And that would be very difficult to duplicate if you were scheduling and setting predetermined schedules of when workers would work. And also keep in mind that a lot of the workers that are working as independent contractors, or particularly in the gig economy, are doing it as a way to potentially make some extra cash on the side. They might be a full-time student. They might be a stay-at-home mom that's trying to fit in a couple hours on the weekend to supplement their income levels. So all of that would be very hard to duplicate outside of an independent contractor status, or with a more rigid setup like being a full status employee. So yes, I think that there is good reason to worry for those workers. If the bill were to go through, it would really, I think, impinge on their flexibility.
As the bill's author, Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez Fletcher and its high-profile supporters like Speaker Anthony Renlund have made very clear in their public statements, the fight over AB5 is really about forcing employers to hire more people as employees rather than independent contractors. So what does your research tell you about the impact that this would have financially and otherwise on California employers? And also, in their push for more Californians to be considered employees and as unionized workers, wouldn't we see jobs and opportunities for some disappear if AB5 were to become law?
Again, that's I think right on. I think that would happen. In order to have full status employees, companies have to pay payroll taxes, Social Security, unemployment insurance. And because of that, independent contractors on average only cost about, I think it's like 66 cents on the dollar for every hour they have worked compared to a full-time employee. So shifting workers from independent contractor status to full status employees would have a huge effect on the businesses and the employers that were hiring those workers. My colleagues and co-author of the recent study that we produced actually has done some research on kind of trying to aggregate what the total cost would be for California businesses were there this kind of forced reclassification of a lot of these industries from independent contractors to employees. And this is my colleague Ian Adams accountants, and he estimated in his calculations, looking at payroll taxes and all the stuff that employers would suddenly have to pay, it would be anywhere from a $1.3 billion to almost a $7 billion additional cost to California businesses were this to go through. So it would have a tremendous impact on businesses and probably would even make some business models unviable, pretty much outright, which would potentially force workers out of jobs or force companies to reduce even pay for some workers in order to cover the increased cost of them being full status employees. The freelance journalist example, I think, is a good one, right? A lot of newspapers are really struggling right now. A lot of them have moved more towards freelance writers. And there is a legitimate question about whether under the ABC test, those writers could really be considered freelance independent contractors anymore, or whether they would have to be full-time employees. And if they are, full status employees, that is going to increase the cost of those papers and would potentially make more of them even less viable than a lot of them are nowadays. So the costs on business would be substantial were AB 5 to be codified.
Quoting Speaker Rendon at a recent rally on the Capitol steps, he said, quote, "When you hear folks talking about the new economy, the gig economy, the innovation economy, it's effing feudalism all over again." How would you respond to the speaker's comments? And based on your research, how would California's innovation economy be impacted if AB 5 actually does become law?
Yeah, so one of the most common arguments in favor of the ABC test, which is now being echoed at the federal level by some Democratic presidential candidates and even by congressional Democrats, is that the workers that are working in the so-called gig economy, usually it's focused on them, are basically being mistreated, that they are basically should be employees, but instead are being treated as independent contractors, and as such are not getting a lot of the benefits that come along with being a full status employee. So things like health insurance, workers' compensation insurance, those kinds of benefits that usually attach to full status employees. And so a lot of people in the labor movement, a lot of people on the left view that as a mistreatment of those workers, and therefore that's why they want them to be reclassified. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, the issue is that most of those workers don't want to be reclassified because they value other parts of their work arrangements of being an independent contractor. They might value the flexibility more than they're concerned about a particular type of non-cash benefit that they would get with full employee status. They may not want or have the time to work the certain hours and schedules they would need to be a full status employee. And I think that the unfortunate thing we can get into a little bit more later as well is that there is other potential options for addressing that concern among many of the politicians on the left about worker benefits. You don't necessarily have to get in this kind of old-fashioned paradigm between just being a full status employee and being an independent contractor. There is a lot of creative solutions, including even things like a portable benefits model or what is often called a worker-controlled benefit exchange, where you could actually allow there to be portable benefits that these different independent contractors, for example, maybe rideshare drivers, could access and take with them from different gig to gig that they go to, but not be necessarily forced into being full status employees. So there, I think, is other ways to address that concern, but that is a lot of the driving force, I think, behind the ABC test. And unfortunately, I think that they're just using kind of a blunt tool to address that issue, and then ignoring kind of all the costs that go along with that, as you referenced and as I previously discussed, which are substantial costs to the businesses themselves. It really disrupts how their business models work, which oftentimes are kind of predicated on fluctuating demand and kind of spontaneous ramping up of the supply of drivers, for example. If it's at a time of heightened demand, that flexible, dynamic ability to be able to respond is kind of a hallmark of how a lot of these innovative companies, gig economy companies work. And so kind of using this old-fashioned, blunt, forced reclassification into full status employees would really disrupt a lot of the way that those businesses work. It really goes to the core of how they operate.
So you just talked a little bit about kind of on a practical side and the issues of benefits and things. In your brief, you talk a little bit about what you call a California model, which you say could be an alternative to AB5. So if not AB5, what do you believe is the ideal way to settle this dispute over who truly is an independent contractor in California and who isn't?
First of all, trying to maintain the flexibility of the workers is key. And there's different ways potentially that can be done. I don't think any of them include forcing them to become full status employees. You could do different things like potentially create a new category of worker. It could be a flexible worker category under the labor code, something in between perhaps an independent contractor or a full status employee that would allow them to maintain their flexibility and also make it so they weren't employers didn't suddenly have to provide a whole bunch of other benefits and stuff that attaches with full status employees. Another option would be creating a safe harbor for them under the law where they could still be kind of given the flexibility and independent contractor status. I think that then potentially coupling that with some kind of portable benefits model, worker-controlled exchange model, where potentially even part of the fee or there'd be a contribution from the part of the fare that you potentially pay, for example, a ride-sharing service, would go towards kind of funding this exchange that would then allow the workers to have some form of benefits. It might likely wouldn't be and shouldn't be maybe as comprehensive as full status employee, but it would certainly, could include things, for example, like, off the top of my head, things like unemployment insurance type coverage or some aspect of a workers' comp insurance, for example, or paid leave. So it could include some of those benefits that are kind of the source of concern for the people that have been pushing the ABC test, but do it in a way that is kind of more of a modern reflection of our workplace and not trying to kind of force everything back into this dichotomy of independent contractor or full status employee. So I think that is a model that's been out there for a while. It's something that my think tank, R Street Institute, has written about for several years now. And it's something that I think that California, should and maybe starting to look at some version of that. There's certainly different ways you could do that. And there's a lot that could be kind of filled in, a lot of fleshing out that general idea. But that would be kind of the general way in which you could find a more nimble policy solution to the issue versus the way that it's being pursued now under AB 5.
If we turn now to occupational licensing reform, which is a big research area of yours as well, and it's also one for us here at PRI, in our Breaking Down Barriers to Opportunity series, we're documenting how overregulation, like occupational licensing laws, are serving as a roadblock for Californians who wish to, work hard, move up the economic ladder, and provide for better lives for their families. I guess to start, what are occupational licenses? Just explain that for our listeners, and then what are their purpose? And according to their supporters, why should they exist in practice? Why do they diminish economic opportunity?
The R Street Institute, we study a lot of different labor policy constraints and barriers, and so part of that might be things like the ABC test, but another big part of that is things like occupational licensing. And occupational licenses are a pretty simple concept to explain. It's basically just a license, a government-issued license or permit that gives you the right to work in a certain industry or in a certain occupation. There's kind of common examples of this that you see a lot. Hairdressers, cosmetology licenses are a big example, and you are not able to work in that field unless you have that license. The justification for them, I guess, first is that you want to make sure that the people operating in those fields are competent and that they're delivering good service, that they are not doing anything dangerous. I think a lot of people would be scared of the concept of an unlicensed doctor, for example. You want to make sure that people aren't having their health and safety threatened. So that's the justification behind requiring people to get this government-mandated credential. So while that sounds well and good, the issue often is twofold. One, that while licensing kind of has its strongest historical roots in, for example, the medical field, like with doctors, and there may be a reason to license some fields like doctors or engineers, perhaps, licensing spread to a bunch of other occupations now. And today, pretty much, I think that the most recent estimates have been 1 in 4 workers in our economy need some form of government license. And they've just gotten absurd. I mean, some states require fortune tellers to have occupational license. Louisiana requires florists who arrange flowers to have an occupational license. Tree trimmers need to have a license. So it's just spread further and further and further to more industries. And the licenses oftentimes are expensive to get. Oftentimes they require a lot of training. You have to go through kind of rigorous training courses that cost money and take a lot of time to be able to qualify for the license. Oftentimes licenses, they won't issue them to people with a prior criminal conviction, even if it's one that they have rehabilitated themselves from, even if it's a minor one sometimes that's not really related to their competency and was from many years ago. And so it acts as a barrier to people trying to work in the industries that have them. And it's essentially a barrier to entry, and it is a cap on upward mobility because it kind of locks a whole portion of workers out of the labor market because many people can't afford or can't spend and dedicate the time to get the licenses they need to work in some of these occupations, and particularly in ones that a lot of lower income or middle income Americans are trying to work in. It disproportionately affects them and freezes them out of the labor market. So that's what occupational licensing is, and that's why it has kind of grown to be a difficult problem.
So you've also written recently about how occupational licensing reform can help to make life a little easier for military families who are constantly on the move from state to state. So first, maybe how are occupational licensing laws in California and other states making it difficult for military spouses who are forced to suddenly move from another state into, California to get a job? And what changes do you recommend that could make it easier for them to earn a living while their spouses are serving our country?
Right. So I mentioned how occupational licenses affect upward mobility. They affect people's ability to climb the economic ladder. They also affect geographic mobility. And that's because almost every state has different requirements or different licenses for different occupations. So what's licensed in California may not be licensed in Florida or vice versa. And so that means that if someone moves from California, where there isn't a license for a particular occupation, and they go to Florida, and all of a sudden Florida requires that occupation to be licensed, that becomes a huge issue. That person can't work in the field that they usually worked in. That's actually a good example of that is that California doesn't require you to be a licensed dietitian just to give out diet advice. So there's been several examples of health coaches that have worked in California, given diet advice to their clients, then moved to Florida, and Florida says only licensed dietitians can give diet advice. So suddenly they're not able to practice their occupation anymore. And then if you think about what demographic is probably the one that's the most mobile in the country, the most likely to move suddenly across the country is military families. And it's because they oftentimes have permanent change of station orders where the service member is moved from a military installation in, again, to use our example from California, to one in Florida. So the service member themselves continues their career, but oftentimes their spouse might be a teacher, might be a hairdresser, might be a health coach, someone who's working in a field that has licensing requirements, and those licensing requirements vary by state. And so they get locked out of the employment market when they move. And they move very frequently. So it's kind of this never-ending problem where they're moved to a new state, have to clear all the licensing hurdles in that new state, and then suddenly they're moving to a third state, and then have to start the process all over again. So it's a large burden on military families, and one that I think is finally starting to get a little bit more attention. I think the best way to address it, I think actually the federal government, despite the fact that most licensing laws are state-based or local-based and are not a federal issue, because it involves the military, the Congress has always been recognized as having power under the Constitution, under the Army and Navy clause, to raise and maintain our military forces. And having big barriers to spousal employment actually affects military retention and in fact negatively affects the willingness of a lot of military families to continue serving. And so I think there's a good argument that Congress could assert itself and actually kind of create reciprocity across state lines, kind of exempt military spouses from the requirements that each state imposes. And I think that would be on solid constitutional grounds and wouldn't run afoul against kind of any federalism principles, which I think are important to keep in mind. But again, given the unique context here, I think that is something that's appropriate. At the subnational level, states themselves have started, and they could do better about being more open and waiving some of those requirements for military families when they move so often, and allowing them to come to a new state and practice in that new state.
Beyond military families, are there any other groups that would disproportionately benefit from effective occupational licensing reform?
Yeah, as I mentioned, the people that it affect, beyond military families, which are just, again, one demographic, although a substantial demographic, it mostly impacts people on the lower end of the economic ladder. And so, you have to think about the person that might be really struggling to make ends meet, is trying to start or break into a new career and wants to kind of use that career as a way to make a living and eventually earn enough money to raise a family. And they just don't have the money or the time to be able to meet the requirements for a license. So if it's, an expensive fee to get a license, or requires really expensive education, for example, cosmetology school can run $8,000 or $9,000 and can be, a very rigorous, long process to go to cosmetology school. A lot of people don't have that time. If they are a single parent, for example, and they don't have the money or time to really dedicate to that, that's who it hurts. And so it hurts the little guy, essentially, which is why I think it's become such an area of focus in the policy community, is that it's not it's not really something that as much as affecting the big players and the big businesses, it's really hurting the little people. That's why I've always been really interested in it and seen it as a pressing issue. And I think that's why it's getting so much more focus over time.
So, Jarrett, as we close, we love to talk about nothing more than drinking adult beverage on our podcast here. And we love to discuss drinking while discussing public policy. And we know that one of your big research interests is government policy on alcohol. And I know you have a new book coming out next year on this that will be called Drink for Your Country. So maybe you could give our listeners a preview of coming attractions. Just how is government policy thwarting our ability to enjoy a great cocktail while talking about overregulation in California?
I appreciate the question, because I too like talking about alcohol. This is something that I could talk all day about, but just to give a brief encapsulation of it, there is perhaps no market or industry in America that is suffering under more antiquated, rigorous, nonsensical laws and regulations than alcohol markets. And really, that's a heritage of our prohibition past. After prohibition, of course, the federal government got out of the business of booze and allowed it. But into that void, states and localities rushed in and had this rush to regulate. And they passed a lot of laws and a lot of legal structures in the immediate post-prohibition aftermath that we're still living with today. And so that's why we still have things like control state in over a dozen states. Still, at the retail level, you have to go to a government-operated store, like my home state of Virginia, for example, to be able to purchase distilled spirits. And that's just incredible when you think about it. There's almost no other comparable in any other industry where you're going to a government retailer for a private good like that. Another structure that came out of prohibition legislation was known as the three-tiered system, which required that producers of alcohol and distributors of alcohol and retailers of alcohol all had to be separate, legally separate entities. Again, almost very few to none parallels in other industries of that. For example, Apple Computers is allowed to produce their computers, and then they also run Apple stores where you can buy your computers, and you can't do that with alcohol. So there's just a lot of these really antiquated laws that are in place and rules that are in place that just make no sense in our modern alcohol market. So that's a lot of what I study. California, itself is, has its share of it too. There's a couple, a year or so ago, WeWork, the popular co-space in California, realized that under state law that while it's okay for employers to get a license to, give their employees beer, for example, on the job site as a perk. You see that in a lot of Silicon Valley companies as a perk to induce workers to come. Well, WeWork really is more of a landlord, right? So they have coworkers come to the space to rent it or use it as a flex working space. And so they actually pulled all the taps, all the beer out of their WeWork co-space because of this. Another thing that's cropped up recently in California is that wineries there have gotten in trouble for using volunteers. So it is something that's very popular right now in the craft spirits space. There's a lot of homebrew enthusiasts. There's a lot of home winemakers who really like to volunteer at a brewery or a winery to learn more about the craft and then do it, at home on their own time. And in California, under the state labor code, that isn't really permissible the way in which the wineries are doing it. So actually, they're trying to pass a bill to exempt kind of these small scale wineries from that. But the wineries themselves both kind of depend on the volunteer labor, and the volunteer labor also depends and enjoys that opportunity to work with the wineries. So those are just two small examples in California, but all of this structure very often derives from kind of this complicated legal heritage that America has with alcohol. And so, as you mentioned, I'm kind of trying to compile the most ridiculous examples and manifestations of this in the book that I'm doing, Drink for Your Country, which will be out in fall of 2020. And the idea is just to highlight some of these different rules and kind of where they came from and why we're dealing with them today.
To that end, we always ask our guests on Next Round to share their recommendations for their favorite beer or wine or adult beverage or other beverage. We get all sorts of interesting answers. So what are you drinking these days to celebrate your upcoming book?
Yeah, one drink that I've been digging recently that actually also traces its heritage to kind of pre-Prohibition era is the Boulevardier. It's a kind of instead of a Negroni where you have gin vermouth and Campari, it's bourbon vermouth and Campari. So it's a very spirit-forward cocktail. It's a very kind of an old-school, traditional cocktail, as I mentioned, but it's incredibly flavorful and complex. Oftentimes we'll drink it up and neat. It's a lot of fun. So that's the main cocktail I've been doing recently, although I really love beer a lot as well. So you're as likely as not to catch me drinking a craft brew than anything.
And what craft brew is your favorite these days?
Oh, my goodness. That's a tough question. I live in the Richmond, Virginia area. Our Richmond's beer scene, we were actually labeled the #1 beer destination in the world by VinePair magazine or website last year. So Richmond's totally exploded. I would have to pick a hometown favorite. I probably actually would pick the Chameleon IPA from Center of the Universe Brewing Company, which is the brewing company just north of Richmond where I live. So they do a great job there, but there's tons of wonderful breweries in Richmond, and any of those would be an easy choice for me. So I'll go with the Homer pick.
Thanks so much, Jarrett.
No problem. Thank you very much. It's great to be on.
Special thanks to our guest Jarrett Dieterle and to my colleagues Tim Anaya and Wayne Weingarten. And if you're interested in learning more about R Street's work, go to rstreet.org. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. We hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.